Welcome to a reading from the Lucasian Legacy, the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at Cambridge University, 1663 to 1993, by Robert Bruen, as read by his son, Garth Bruen. Charles Babbage, 1828 to 1839. It is unworthy of excellent men to lose hours like slaves in the labor of calculation, which could be relegated to anyone else if machines were used. Gottfried von Leibniz. Charles Babbage, 1792 to 1871, the 11th Lucasian professor, was a polymath. According to the Dictionary of Scientific Biography, Babbage explored the areas of cryptanalysis, probability, geophysics, astronomy, altimetry, ophthalmology, statistical linguistics, meteorology, actuarial science, lighthouse technology, and the tree rings of historic climatic records. He published in the fields of magnetism, biology, geology, religion, submarines, politics, economics, and machinery. These accomplishments were in addition to his main work in mathematics and his calculating engines. He was awarded the first gold medal presented by the Astronomical Society. Babbage was active in efforts to reform the education and science of his time, which were in a sad state of affairs. He lived in times of great change. England was in the midst of transformation from a rural society to one of city dwellers, and London was rising to become a great city of Europe. His destiny, for all his ability and achievements, was to have little impact on his own times. Babbage thought more like a man of the 20th century than one in the 19th century. Like a great artist, his impact was felt more after his life was over. Babbage entered Trinity College, Cambridge in 1810, transferred to Peterhouse College, and graduated first in his class in 1814. He received M.A. in 1817. The transfer to Peterhouse was reported to have been motivated by his fear of finishing third in his class behind John Herschel and George Peacock, his cohorts at the Analytical Society. But this is disputed by Enross, who claims that Babbage did not meet Herschel or Peacock until after the transfer, and furthermore was in the class behind them, so he would have been examined after they graduated. Babbage probably transferred to expand his freedom to do what he wanted, which is more consistent with the way he lived. In 1812, Babbage helped to found the Analytical Society at Trinity College to reform the notation and teaching of calculus. At the time, England had fallen behind the rest of Europe in mathematics, caused by two main choices made by British mathematicians. The first was the use of Newton's notation in calculus rather than Leibniz's notation. The second choice was a generalization of the first to ignore mathematical developments on the continent in favor of British mathematicians. Mathematics was moving ahead in France, but England did not try to learn or keep up. Babbage tried to change that with the founding of the Analytical Society and other efforts throughout his life. Babbage was abroad when he learned of his appointment as the Lucasian chair, and he immediately prepared a letter of refusal. He was talked into accepting the post by friends who convinced him that others had fought hard to get him the chair, and it would have been a terrible blow to them if he refused. So the letter was never sent. Once appointed, however, he did not really participate as it was hoped he would. He did not give any lectures as the Lucasian professor and spent his time in London working on his calculating machines. When he finally resigned from the professorship 10 years later, it was to focus on his calculating machines. It appears that he considered the position simply a source of income of between 80 and 90 pounds per year. A number of major changes occurred in mathematics during this period. Noteworthy was the shift of algebra as an arithmetic idea to arithmetic as a specialized case of algebra. Robert Woodhouse had laid the groundwork for this development for Babbage, and Peacock made the final drive over the threshold. This was an important release for mathematicians. Algebra had been viewed mainly as arithmetic that used symbols instead of numbers. not as a branch of mathematics standing on its own. With the understanding of the symbolic nature of algebra as a system that worked with reference to any particular numerical value, algebra became more of a general of the two. Now arithmetic could be seen as a particular case for algebra. The release was the ability to assign meaning to symbols and manipulate them as symbols. Even the equal sign took on new meaning. It no longer meant equal to, but rather algebraically equivalent to. This advance is detailed in Peacock's work, but it also appeared earlier in Babbage's work. Because the two mathematicians worked together for years and learned from Woodhouse, it is not surprising that both had something to say on the topic. A further development of Babbage was the invention of the calculus of functions. He also worked in the areas of geometry, number theorem, probability, and infinite series. A second major advance during this period was the extension of geometry past its Euclidean origins. Babbage showed an interest in the mathematical notation throughout his career, beyond the calculus notation controversies. In order to progress in mathematics, Babbage believed that good notation was critical and fundamental characteristic of logical reasoning. He wrote several papers on notation beyond his memoirs. He was ahead of his time when it came to symbolic manipulation. He even invented notation for mechanical drawing. The work that took up Babbage's adult life was his compute engines. The two main engines, the difference engine and the analytical engine, were different in purpose, design, and success, but they are important steps in the history of computers. These engines were also a great source of frustration and difficulty for Babbage, who never really profited from them. As mentioned before, they were also an avenue from which George Airy caused Babbage serious difficulties. Babbage did not invent the mathematical calculator, but he added significant improvements with his new approach, including the idea of mechanically printing the results directly from the engine, an idea we take for granted today. Remarkably, he accomplished this over 100 years before anyone else attempted the construction of modern electronic computers. One of the main drawbacks of the early mechanical calculators was the need for constant human intervention. Generally speaking, the term computer referred to a room full of people performing computations at that time. One must appreciate the state of calculations and the value of tables in performing complex calculations during the 1800s to grasp the significance of Babbage's proposal for a machine that would automatically produce tables. The order of achievement is equivalent to the invention of movable type in book printing. The greatest advance in calculations up to this point had been the discovery of logarithms by John Napier in 1614. Performing long, complex calculations by hand was a formidable task for even the best of minds and prone to error. Logarithms made it easier by reducing multiplication to addition and division to subtraction. But it was still an arduous and time-consuming process. Tables were greatly needed by banks, sailors, the military, government bureaucrats, engineers, and architects. George Airy, the royal astronomer, had spent much of his career producing tables for astronomical events. Some important tables constructed in ancient times took as many as 50 educated men 12 years to complete and were paid for by kings. Babbage offered a great deal of his idea for a machine to produce such tables in such a short time. One problem was, of course, that not many people of this time were capable of seeing what he saw. In 1822, Babbage completed the construction of the first mechanical calculator capable of calculating tables of logarithmic and trigonometric functions to 6 decimal places. With this proof of concept, he began the work for the difference engine in 1834. He started to design the analytical engine, the true precursor of today's computers. This engine used punched cards, one set for operations and another for variables. The punched cards had 3 functions: to input a constant, to input a variable, and an instruction. The variable card could store a variable and later referred to that stored variable, so it would be placed into the processor. The instruction cards would be interpreted by the main processor. Then instructions were fed to the subparts of the engine as appropriate. The engine never actually ran, but Augusta Ada Byron, Countess of Lovelace, wrote the first computer program for the engine to calculate Bernoulli numbers. The programming language Ada is named after her. She was Babbage's lifelong friend and collaborator after their initial meeting in 1833. The analytical engine was a major leap forward in concept from the difference engine. It was not just a calculator of tables, but a processor, which Babbage called the mill, memory, which Babbage called the store, and a printer. He envisaged a control program that used punch cards, variables, and operators. All of the fundamental parts of today's computers, although we have advanced past the use of punch cards, one of the most interesting features was the engine's ability to make decisions based on calculations it had performed. It was not limited to a sequential calculation to produce a statistic table, but could choose to perform the next operation depending on how the previous operation turned out. This feature made the engine appropriate for many more applications. For the remainder of his life, Babbage concentrated on the design and test of the engine. Unable to obtain funding from the government for its development after Airy's assessment that it could be worthless, he nevertheless continued to think about it. His thinking led him to produce hundreds of excellent engineering design drawings of the engine and its various parts. Babbage's genius produced the analytical engine, an invention that could have revolutionized industry and science during his lifetime. Babbage himself was well aware of the problem, writing in passages, "The discovery of the analytical engine is so much in advance of my own country, and I fear even of the age, that it is very important for its success that the fact should not rest on my unsupported testimony." Thank you for listening to this segment of The Lucasian Legacy, the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at Cambridge University by Robert Bruen. To learn more or support this podcast, go to lucasianchair.org or our Instagram account, Lucasian Legacy.